All right, good evening, everyone. Come on in and get your seat. I was going to give Freddie a heads up, but we'll wait on him. It's good to have everyone here as we are beginning a new series of classes. We got a lot that are starting up with a new quarter. We're here in the winter semester, the winter quarter. So a little bit of differences that you saw on Sunday. We're studying through the book of Romans, and we're doing that introduction for 3 weeks, and then we're going to have breakout classes on Sunday morning, focusing on different topics from the book of Romans. And what we're doing here on Wednesday night is not related to the book of Romans. We're going to be studying the book of Joshua. That way we can mix up a little bit of New Testament and Old Testament. And so Brian and I are going to be working through the book of Joshua, and we're going to do it a little bit differently than maybe you would expect. We're not going to go verse by verse or chapter by chapter. We're going to look at it from a topical standpoint, specifically looking at leadership principles. The book of Joshua is so fascinating for a number of different reasons. It contains stories that we are really familiar with, ones that we can retell, talking about the story of Jericho. Maybe we're talking about the Israelites as they come into the promised land, and you've got the Jordan River that backs up. You've got the situation with Achan as a result of things that come after Jericho, the story of Rahab, and those are all within like the first 6 chapters. Outside of that, though, maybe you're reading through the book of Joshua and you get to those places where it's not just going through a genealogy of names, it's going through an allotment of land. And so I love the book of Joshua, but you do have a section in there you get to and you're like, okay, hold on now. I've gotten to this, and it's just, this is for this person, this is for this group, this is for that person, this is for that group, and you just go along, go through it, and you're like, okay, I'm a little lost here. Well, that's all right. We're going to have some ideas that we can share from there, but essentially what we're doing all across the book, though, is looking at Joshua as an individual and decisions that he made as he interacted with the Israelites, taking up the mantle after Moses. And there are many things that we can learn from him that we want to follow ourselves. And so what I'm going to do tonight is just introduce this concept all around one specific question. We were coming up with an outline of what we wanted to accomplish in this series of classes, and we thought, all right, the first one needs to be, how did we get here? All right, how do we get to the book of Joshua? And so I'm going to try and fold in some different ideas about leadership, but also what's happening with the story of the Israelites to bring us over to what's happening in the book of Joshua. We've been able to study on Sunday mornings leading into this quarter. We've been looking at the book of Exodus. And so I'm going to make some connections based off of those studies, how we go from the book of Exodus to where we are in Joshua and even beyond that. Because Joshua is going to fit very specifically in a theme for what God is trying to do with his people. And I'm going to look at some very specific verses out of these books. Some of them are going to be at the beginning and the end of the books, and you're going to be able to hang things together. And the way that I like to think about it is if you're to take a little thread and you're going to put a pin in one verse and take it to the next verse and put a pin, you're going to see this common theme. But think about the book of Exodus, okay? We've had the Israelites that have come up out of Egypt. They had been waiting in Egypt for a number of years, growing as a nation. And I think one thing to consider why they were growing as a nation is that God was preparing them to be a strong enough force to be able to come into the promised land. Now, the first battle they're going to have in the promised land is one where they don't have to have any military might to start off with, but then they're going to have to go through with a strong arm and fight against Jericho. But initially, God's going to say, look, I'm going to be with you wherever you go and whatever you do. Then I'm going to exceed your expectations, and I'm going to guide you the same way that you're going, throughout the Exodus. They're going to see the plagues and things like this. He says that's just going to be God's outstretched arm, that he's going to be able to lead his people. And you follow the Israelites through all of these different things, and you're going to find God preparing them, I think, as a group of people to do his will. When Abraham is first given the promised land, back in Genesis chapter 12, when the promise is made to him, he was just a small household. Even when he grew big enough between, him and his nephew Lot, where they had the divide because of how big of a nation, how big of a group they became, they still were not equipped fully to run out all these different nations that are going to be in the promised land. And we even see there in Genesis chapter 15 where God's speaking of the Amalekites that their sins have not come to fruition in their entirety yet. And that was what was going to be required for the Israelites to come through, and they were going to press them out. Essentially, I think God was also giving them time as well. But the Israelites have now come out of Egypt, and they've been at Mount Sinai, receiving the commandments of God, And then we're going to go on from there and make some of these connections. Let's go to Exodus chapter 40. Exodus 40, we're going to look at verses 33 through 38. I want to show how the book ends. All right. I know we've been studying it. We studied in breakout classes down the hallway, but also worked through it here in the auditorium. The last idea that we get in the book of Exodus is this. And I'm starting in verse 33. You can see it's above that subheading if you have one of those in your Bible. And speaking of Moses, he erected the court around the tabernacle and the altar and set up the screen of the gate of the court. So Moses finished the work. Everything was preparatory to this point, bringing them to where they could take the tabernacle, build it, and this is what happens once they build it. Verse 34, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, and Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, they would not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day and fire on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. Have this solidified in our mind. This is going to help us understand leadership as well from God's perspective. God is with his people. There was a very obvious thing that they witnessed, very physical, that they saw this cloud that was over the tabernacle. The tabernacle was actually the very center of their camp. Wherever they went in the wilderness wanderings, when the tabernacle would set up, the cloud would come over it and everybody camped around it. It was the focal point. That's where everyone came to worship. All the sights and the sounds and the smells and everything that was involved in that was the centerpiece. And it wasn't just a building, was it? It was a reminder that God is there. And every time the Israelites lost their focus, God would have to bring them back to their focus being on him. So we end the book of Exodus with this idea of the tent of meeting, but really it's the glory of God in the midst of his people, leading them. Who decided when it was time to pack up camp and when it was time to set out? God. Who told them when to stop? God. He is the initial leader for the Israelites. Now, there's going to be something significant that happens with Moses because he's the one that is the prophet, the one that God is going to speak to face. And even as we saw in the book of Exodus, that Moses was God to the people. He was that go-between. All right, and he's told that specifically from God. But let's continue on as we're connecting these books, bringing us up to the book of Joshua. We have off to the side a little bit the book of Leviticus. It's going to be the specific commandments that are given to the Levites, the ones who are to lead in the worship, those that were the priest and those that were ministering the tabernacle and all of those things that are involved in it. And it's going to sit a little bit to the side of the book of Exodus. And I want to draw our attention to a few verses from here. In Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1, in verse 2, the Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. All right, so can you see your connection? You know, I've got an open page right here and I can look. So we've got the tent of meeting where Moses is, and God's going to have a conversation with Moses right there in the tent. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd, from the flock. Okay, he tells him, he's like, all right, if you're going to come before my presence, this is what I want you to do. They're in the tent of meeting, and this is the conversation they're going to have. Now let's go to the end of the book of Leviticus. Let's look at chapter 27, verse 34. These are the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses for the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. Any commandment that God gives his people, it is for them to be able to draw near to him. If he is going to lead, what does it look like when his people follow? There's going to be commandments. There's going to be rules. There are things that you're going to have to do. This is going to be spelled out specifically with the book of Joshua. When Joshua is leading the people, he's going to turn back to them. He's going to say, this is what we need to do. These are the commandments that we need to follow. Here are the directions that we are going to need to keep up with, and here are the consequences if we don't. Think about the story of Jericho. The commandments, teachings, exactly what they're to do to draw near to God, but also to accomplish his task. All right, so we hinge from here, going from the book of Exodus. We have a little offshoot to the book of Leviticus. But if we connect from here to the book of Numbers, we're going to get some more narrative that's going to tell us a little bit more about what's happening with the Israelites. Let's go to Numbers chapter 1, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they had come up out of the land of Egypt, saying, all right, so here's the theme. Wherever God is, God's going to be the one that's giving the directions, and he's going to tell them what to do, and that's what happens in the book of Numbers. We're going to see the people interact with God. They've been at Mount Sinai witnessing all of the things that are going on the top of the mountain with Moses going up and down and speaking to the people. Joshua's going to be there, and we're going to learn more about him next week as a leader, and you're going to see how he correlates to Moses and what Moses is doing. But as the people are there at Mount Sinai, they're getting all these commandments, and they're learning how to respond to God, and they're learning how to interact with him, and they also do some very poor things. They make poor decisions, and there's consequences to that. You continue in the book of Numbers, and you find their mistakes, you find their successes, and you find how they are meant to follow God, and they don't do it. But when they do, they're blessed for it. If you flip over to the end of the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 36, verse 13. These are the commandments and the rules that the Lord commanded through Moses to the people of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. Now, as we're reading through this, we're missing a lot of time. I would want you to go through and read the book of Numbers to figure out how much time has passed. But you already know what happens there, don't you? When they left Mount Sinai and they started going toward the promised land, they got distracted, and there were consequences that resulted in them being in the wilderness for 40 years. We find them now at the brink of the Jordan River. And this is significant for our study because this is where Joshua is going to come in. But there's one more book we got to plug in before we get to Joshua, and this is, once again, setting the context. If you're following along as if it were a timeline, and you have gone up out of Egypt with them, and you've watched them follow God all along the way and listen to his commandments and find Moses in there and learn how to learn from Moses, when they get to Jericho, there's a lot of, the Jordan River, there's a lot of things that happen in there. And this is why the book of Deuteronomy helps us. The book of Deuteronomy all takes place at the brink of the Jordan River. Moses is recounting what they went through previously. He's telling them, do you know how we ended up here? Well, let me tell you a few quick things. If you wanted a better lesson of this, we studied this in the auditorium maybe last summer, somewhere along there, that we looked at the book of Deuteronomy and talked about untying the law, and you can go back and reference that. But Moses is standing here and he's saying, look, I want you to remember where we've come from and how we got here and what God is going to do beyond this point. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, these are the words that Moses spoke to all of Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness in the Arabah, opposite of Suf, between Paran, Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Dizahab. These locations, they're right here at the brink of the Jordan River. They're at the east of it, and the west is the promised land. Connecting, once again, the book of Numbers to Deuteronomy, these little hinges that we're following one place to the other. It's what he says, while we're here in the wilderness, let me remind you guys about the law. This is why it's called Deuteronomy, the second telling. But look at Deuteronomy 34. And let's find how the story ends here to bring us to Joshua. In Deuteronomy 34, starting in verse 9, and Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there's not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him, for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all the servants and to all the land, and for all the mighty power and the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of all of Israel. Moses is now gone. A few chapters before this that we'll make mention of as well. Moses has died. He's not able to go into the promised land. And he has tasked Joshua to pick up the mantle and continue on. But there's this little just point that's made in there. All the things that Joshua is going to do. I mean, he starts off with a miracle happening in front of him as the Jordan's going to be backed up, and so many other things that happen along the way. It still pales in comparison for what Moses did. And you don't see anything like Moses until later when you see Jesus. And when you see Jesus, you see a lot more than what Moses did. And it continues on from there. But as we're looking through the story, we have now gotten to the point of Joshua. He has picked up what Moses was doing. He's been tasked specifically by God to lead the people. And after Joshua, and this will be a theme that will connect as well, you're going to see the book of Judges. And we'll make some connection to that in just a moment. So have in your mind this timeline of the first 6 books of the Bible. You've gone from creation all the way through the people coming into the promised land. The reason why it's called the promised land is because God promised his people through Abraham, this is where you're going to dwell. It is your place, but there are going to be some people there that you're going to have to get rid of because of their sin. So let's talk about the book of Joshua a little bit more. All right, so we've got a context maybe. We've connected this thread and we've hinged from one book to the other and got an idea, all right, how did we get here? As we talk about the book of Joshua, I want to focus a little bit more on Joshua as an individual. Like I said, we're going to have a whole lesson dedicated to this next week. But there's some things that we'll notice. As Joshua is first, one of the times that Joshua is introduced in the book of Numbers, chapter 13, verse 16, it says, Moses called Hoshea, the son of Nun, Joshua. It's interesting that Joshua has his name changed. Originally, it is Hoshea. Now, Hoshea means salvation or deliverance, and his name is changed to Joshua, which means Yahweh is salvation or deliverance. I love when names get changed, especially when they have significance behind them. Sometimes names are changed in the Bible, and it's not for a good reason. It's a different title that is given to them, but someone like Joshua, he was already being prepped all the way down to for your name's sake. Hold that in your mind, because I think that has a lot of significance to it, even down to the name. Where is his focus? It's not on anything that Joshua is going to do. It's going to be on what God does. If you're going to look at a little bit of timeline, just as we go from the Exodus to the story of Joshua, if you just wanted some timeline on there, if the Exodus happened around the 1440s, you go to Moses' death a number of years after that, because we see Moses living, right, for 120 years. That's spelled out for us in his first 80 years as we look at him in Egypt and then in the wilderness, as a shepherd and then in the wilderness. But we also get, as the story of Joshua comes along, a short amount of time after the death of Moses, how much land they're able to cover, literally, as he distributes the land and gives it to all of the Israelites and what they're supposed to take possession of. But we also have a timestamp in Joshua's life as well. We know the age that he dies. And so just looking at his lifespan and all the things that he was able to accomplish, but even in his old age, because one of the things he's supposed to do, and we'll see this later on as well, just put little seeds out there for you to consider. When Joshua is given his allotment of land, he still has to claim it. Just a little bit of breakdown of the book, if you just want to, what each one of the sections is. The first chapter is going to be your introduction, all right, giving us who Joshua is, but also introducing us to the task that he is given to lead the people. Outside of that, you find the preparation for them to enter the promised land. There are things that they're going to have to do that are going to exceed our expectation. It's not what you would expect an army to do before they're going to come in and wipe out other people. There's going to be some preparation that's involved. You find our major stories in chapters 5 through 8 with Jericho and Ai. I say major because we're the most familiar with those. Outside of that, in chapter 9 and 10, you're going to find a group of people that are called the Gibeonites. And you're going to find the deception that they had and the consequences, not just for them, but also for the Israelites falling prey to that. But really what happens is they fail to listen to God. Then you get in chapter 11. Some of these other conquests where they went to this place and they killed this person and these kings that were there and this is the battle that happened. And so maybe you get a little lost in there. I'll try and provide some maps along the way as we look through these sections. But this is going to be in the north, okay? And then you get to chapter 13 and this is where the land is doled out. Now there are some unique things to find in the distribution of land. There's actually a really neat break that happens in chapter 18 where it goes back to the tent of meeting. And then you find the distribution of land again, but it's going to say, hey, this is all the people that you haven't run out yet. Your job's not done. This is your land, but somebody's living in it. Now, over here, we succeeded. Over here, you got to keep it up. So there's even little themes that you can find, and so don't get burned out too quickly off of the names that you find in there. Look for the significance that's even found. But maybe if you wanted a simple shortcut, just an encouragement in your mind, think about this is fulfilling the promise that was given to Abraham and how God knew this was going to happen. Even as you look at the 12 sons of Jacob when they are given allotments, you find all of this. And then the very end, another section that we're familiar with, chapter 24, the epilogue where Joshua encourages the people in his old age. Let's talk about a few more things, leading us just understanding the book of Joshua and how it all fits together. There's another common idea that you're going to find of who comes next. The people are wanting to know who's going to lead us when Moses is gone. Moses doesn't get to go in the promised land. Is Joshua going to lead us the same way that Moses led us? Is he going to fail like Moses? What's he going to do? They're going to stop and wait. But something interesting as well, and this is where I left off with the book of Judges, who comes after Joshua? There's a theme that you'll see, and this goes even further in the Bible, just looking at some other ideas. Joshua 1, verse 1, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant. If you look for that phrase, after the death of, you're going to find it all through the book of Joshua. Well, you're going to find it at the beginning of Joshua. You're going to find it at the beginning of Judges. So let's just go ahead and put that one up there as well. And then you're going to go through the time of the kings after so-and-so dies. After so-and-so dies. What did they leave behind? Because qualities of a good leader, you're going to be able to judge them based off of their life and what they leave behind. After their death, what does it look like? What remains? Find that in each one of the books. But in Judges chapter 1, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? There's no successor. There's no one named specifically like Joshua, and they want to know. And God answers by telling them, this group of people will go up. There's something we can learn from it. You get to the end of the book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This idea of leaving a legacy, but also leaving a path of leadership, what comes from this? We get to the end of Judges, and we're going to find this theme of leadership is that you're going to go to the time of the kings. And this is going to be important. Well, let's stop and consider something as we get a little further into this. I want to ask the question for you to consider, what is a leader? Is it someone that has a solid rank? Is it because of somebody's status, their clout? Is it the style that they live or the way that they speak, the way that they're able to execute business, whatever it may be? What do you consider to be a leader? I think if you want to understand a leader a little bit more, you also have to consider just a principle that we find with that Jesus implements for us. He tells us that you'll know a tree by its fruit. If you want to know the quality of a tree, now you can look at it to see, is it diseased or not, but you can look at its fruit to see what it produces. And that's going to tell you a lot about the tree. You can also learn a lot about a tree by looking at the trees that are around it, because a fruit that comes off the tree, it's going to plant seeds. They're going to get distributed. I always tell people that if you want to know what kind of person you are, look at the people around you, because you're going to attract people like you. This also applies to organizations, but also think about a church. I notice this as I speak to ministry friends, and something we can even evaluate of ourselves. A church will look like their leader. There's a certain personality that our eldership has that it draws a certain type of people to that. Whether it's a ministry leader, a deacon, or whoever it may be, you're going to find a group's going to look like their leader. That's just kind of how these things work. But it's also showing us the principle, you'll know a tree by its fruit. There's more things that we'll learn about a leader, but there's something more that Jesus says in Matthew chapter 20, 25 through 28. But Jesus called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. So there's a bad leader. The Gentiles had a way of making things, or they would show us how the world operates. They have somebody that lords it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It's not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. The principle that we're going to find about leadership, even in the book of Joshua, is servant. A leader is a servant. They're willing to go first and do what needs to be done. As we come back to the book of Joshua, there's a few things that I want us to think about from here, just thinking about leaders. If you think about Israel's leadership, all right, past and present and future, going from Moses, there's a lot of things that we can learn about Moses as a leader. There are some character flaws that we can find in Moses. There are things that he did really well. There are also some issues that he had along the way. You find Joshua learning from those. If you look at just the narrative, the story of Moses, and you place Joshua along with him, he's going to be at some very pivotal scenes, and he's going to be watching Moses, and it makes you wonder, what did he learn from him that he implemented later, and where did he go from there? There's also, what's interesting, after Joshua, there is actually a group of people that we're going to find leading. There's a group of elders that come after Joshua. And this is going to be important for us to highlight along the way as well. But if you go to the end of Joshua chapter 24, looking at, we'll start in verse 29. After these things, Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. Verse 31. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. After the elders, there's the judges. And the judges are interesting characters, right? Some of them are charismatic leaders that you can follow. Some of them you look at, and to quote one of our good friends, they are moral degenerates. But that's the thing. You've got these people like Samson that are leading the people, but you look at him, he's like, look at the things that he's doing. He's considered to be a man of faith in Hebrews chapter 11, but there are some things that I would not want to do that Samson did. But we look at Joshua, though. He serves the role as a very good leader that we would want to implement his principles. There are things that we can learn from him. But once again, you have to learn, what did he leave behind? There's maybe some ideas that we can take from it. But then also think about the kings. Are there some really good kings that we would want to follow? Absolutely. Are there some really good kings that did some really bad things? Absolutely. But can we chew up the fish and spit out the bones? Can we learn from them? And that's why I like these narratives, and what we can get in the Old Testament is that you can learn to live like them, but also learn from their mistakes, because that's how we interact together. And that's even a good leader will acknowledge their mistakes and help people learn from it as they learn from it as well. But over the top of all of this, if we think about leadership, we have to consider that God is the ultimate leader. These men would not be in their role if God didn't put them there. All of them in turn. This is exactly what Paul talks about in Romans chapter 13. Is that God is the source of authority. Do we learn to live by it or not? So what are some other observations that we can make from the book of Joshua? All right, so we're going to see that he exhibits these leadership principles. All right, let's go back to Deuteronomy 34. Deuteronomy chapter 34. Let's look again at when he is tasked as a leader. Look at verse 9. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid hands on him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. He exhibits these leadership principles. Well, what does it look like to be a leader? Well, we're going to find out what Joshua did and his mindset. I'm going to get an idea in Joshua chapter 1 where God speaks to him and he says, this is the kind of person I want you to be. Here's what I need you to focus on. Here's the attitude and the virtues that you need to possess. Here's what's going to determine your marching orders and where you're going to go from here. But keep this in your mind. He's going to exhibit these leadership principles. But there's this other idea coming from it, is that God is always the one that's in control. Let's go to Joshua chapter 1, starting in verse 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise and go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. Now what did you notice here? Joshua is tasked with a very specific job. Who's doing the tasking? Focus on just this part of the conversation. We'll get more into it in another lesson. Moses, my servant. God is the one that's recognizing Moses. You give the command to Joshua. You arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them. Whose land is it? It's God's. Now, he promised it to Abraham and to Abraham's descendants, but who really controls it? God does. Into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. God is really the one that's in control. That's where we get ourselves in trouble, isn't it? Is when we put ourselves in the place of God. If you read Romans chapter 1, that's the issue with sin. Yes, John says in 1 John that all sin is lawlessness, but at the heart of sin is a rebellion against God where we want to be God. In Genesis chapter 3 with man and woman, when they sinned, they wanted to be like God, usurping control. A leader will recognize that all authority comes from God, and they'll live accordingly. Something else that you can observe in the book of Joshua, the conquest show a fulfillment of God's land promise to Abraham. Go back to Genesis chapter 12 and let's look at exactly what is told to Abraham before he was even in the land. In Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 1, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your family's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I'll bless you and make your name great so that you'll be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and you, all the families of the earth, shall be blessed. What God told Abram while he was still in his homeland, a far distance away from the land that he has not seen yet, that he can't even imagine, God says, I'm putting things into play. Even when Abram maps it out, when he walks around the promised land, he still can't comprehend exactly what all is required in it. And it's not something he really gets to enjoy. It's something that his descendants will enjoy in its entirety later on. It's all a fulfillment of God's promise. Once again, connecting Joshua 1 to what God is doing all along the way. There's some other things that you'll notice you go through the book of Joshua. You're watching them drive out the inhabitants of the land, and they're going to fail. It's not a complete removal of all of these people. That's the goal. I want you to go through and I want you to wipe out these nations. I want you to drive them out because of the abominations that they're doing. They're worshiping gods that are not gods. They're worshiping gods who are requiring the people to do some really horrendous things. And God is saying, I want you to go and get rid of them. But something we learn as well is that God has an open door for anybody that wants to follow him. We're introduced to someone like Rahab. Jericho could have repented the same way that Nineveh did, and they didn't have to be overthrown. Had everyone's in Jericho had their heart melted like Rahab's, then they would have come to follow the Lord as well. But that's one of the tasks that the Israelites are given. Go into the land and drive out the sin that is there. But they don't do it. Which is why Joshua will say, toward the end, and we'll look at chapter 23 in just a second, he gives them some very specific warning about don't let your hearts be led away from God. Well, let's look at a few of these things. Let's go back to Joshua chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Look at some of the things that are going on here. Joshua 13. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years. So we know he lived 110 years, right? So this is when he's old and advanced. And the Lord said to him, "You're old and advanced in years, and there remains yet very much land to possess." You're not done. Somebody's going to have to pick it up when you're not able to. Verse 2, "This is the land that yet remains, all the regions of the Philistines." Now, if we want to be good students of the word, what is one of the biggest enemies that the judges fight against? Philistines. What about when David becomes king? Who does he fight against? The Philistines. Had the task been accomplished here, that would not have been the battle. They would have been able to avoid certain battles had it been accomplished. Something to consider. If we jump down a few verses, though, in verse 6, in the middle of it, it says, "I myself will drive them out from before the people of Israel. Only allot the land to Israel for an inheritance, as I have commanded you, and then divide up the land in this way." Chapter 18, as I told you, this is kind of that hinge point here. In chapter 18, verse 1, "Then the whole congregation of the people of Israel assembled at Shiloh to set up the tent of meeting there. The land lay subdued before them." So where do you go as a leader? You go where God can be found. Verse 2, "There remained among the people of Israel 7 tribes whose inheritance had not yet been apportioned." So the chapters leading to this, you have some of the 12 sons of Jacob that their land's already been granted, and he's like, okay, you can go there. We've already won those places. But we have 7 others that don't have allotted land. Verse 3, "So Joshua said to the people of Israel, 'How long will you put off going in to take possession of the land, which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you?' There was still work to be done. Which is why we get to his admonition in chapter 23. Starting in verse 1. "A long time afterward," so read it as a narrative you get to this point. "A long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all the surrounding enemies, Joshua was old and well advanced in years." All right, so we've seen that before. So that's where you have to connect those verses together as you read this. You'll read the story, and then you'll back up a little bit, go back in time, and you'll read it again, or you'll go forward in time and have to go back. That's kind of how these books work, but this is one of those connective tissues here. Verse 2, "Joshua summoned all Israel, its elders and heads, its judges and officers, and said to them, 'I'm now old and well advanced in years. And you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. For it is the Lord your God who has fought for you.'" Because really, who's doing all the work? Who's doing all the heavy lifting? It's always God. And they should learn from that on what he's able to do. Verse 4, "Behold, I have allotted to you an inheritance for your tribes, those nations that remain." Verse 5, jump down there. "The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight, and you shall possess their land, just as the Lord your God promised you. Therefore be very strong to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, turning aside from it neither to the right hand nor to the left, that you may not mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the name of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day." You continue in the next chapter as well. You see what's happening here. The task isn't done, and there's the warning that we've known all along the way. Moses said the same thing. God, through Moses, said, "Look, I'm worried that your hearts are going to be led away when you come into this land and you see the other gods and you even start intermarrying with the people there, your heart's going to be led astray. You've got to be stronger than this." Joshua says the same thing. He's worried about them. Aren't we worried about our children, about our families, about those that we're close to? We want them to stay devoted to the Lord and not have their hearts led astray. Verse 11, "Be very careful, therefore, to love the Lord your God." Now, as we're reading this, if you're familiar with Joshua 1, do you see the same language? What's happening is Joshua is telling them exactly what he knows to be true. Is what he's going to say in chapter 24, "As for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. I've made this decision. Will you do it as well?" But this idea of the conquest were left unfinished, there's going to be a time when they will be finished. And what you find is the responsibility falls on each individual to follow God's leadership. It really doesn't matter who's in charge. Whether it's someone like Samson, Deborah, Saul, David, Jeroboam. All these kings, all these leaders, whose responsibility is it? Regardless what the person does, you've got to be right. And we find this examples in other times, even when Moses was leading something like Korah, where he comes up and he says, I don't like how you're leading. I don't like what you and Aaron are doing. You're putting yourself above everybody else, and we don't want to do it. And they find out they're really rejecting God as leader. Now, if we're going to take all these things from Joshua, and just a few ideas to wrap up class tonight, what are some of the connections that you can make with Joshua as a leader, but also going through the rest of the Bible? First off, God determines the criteria for a leader. We see this in Numbers chapter 27, 16 through 23, when Joshua is selected as a leader, but also other people as well. God's going to be the one that tells us how to live. And even our virtues and things that we hold dear, those are all things that are wrapped up in the heart of God. As the people are going through the land, there are times where they receive rest, but it's not in its entirety. Some of the verses that we have highlighted here, but also want you to think about Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 13. There's a reference to Joshua that says that he didn't actually grant the people rest. There's a rest that is coming. Essentially, he's saying, for us as Christians, we don't get to rest until we get to heaven. Every day is a fight. Every day is a conquest. Make sure your heart is not led away from God. And I think this is a neat connection. Even the name Jesus has connections to an idea of deliverance and as a leader. If you go to Matthew chapter 1, Matthew chapter 1, verse 21. As the angel tells Mary that she's going to have a child, she'll bear a son, to Joseph, she'll bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Where do you find the full accomplishment, or victory rather, against sin? We find glimpses through the Old Testament. We find glimpses through the Bible, examples that we can learn from where battles against sin have been won. But it's fully accomplished in Jesus. Jesus will be the one that leads the final conquest because he's the one that is able to save us from our sins. He is our Savior. In Ephesians chapter 1, 15 through 23, we find Jesus sitting at the right hand of God, and all of his enemies are under his feet. In Philippians 2, you find Jesus as a servant, but as a leader, and all knees will bow before him. In Colossians chapter 1, Jesus is God, and all things are under his feet, and he is the head, he is the authority. He's the one to whom we listen. As we introduce the book of Joshua, I want you to have in your idea what all we can learn from it. It's not going to be just a study of the book itself. It's going to be a study of what we can find Joshua implementing in ways that we can live it out in our own lives. So next week, we'll focus on Joshua as a leader and dive into it even more. Appreciate you guys. Glad you were here this evening. Things are going on right now. New series of classes. I hope those started off well across the building. Do acknowledge that our students will be heading out this week. They're finishing up exams and they're going to be all over the place. A few be graduating and going on to bigger and better things, but we're excited for those that are sticking around. We'll continue to pray for y'all and look forward to you coming back next semester. Just a few updates for our members, things that will be in the bulletin tomorrow. Some updates on the sick. Wayne Hatcher was able to go home from the hospital after his procedure, and he's doing well from that. It's good to get back with Miss Jean. I know that went a long ways as well. So many of you have been praying and checking on them, and I know God certainly took care of him through all of that, although there's some obstacles along the way. We also note that Doug Schofield got good results from his heart cath on Monday, but still looking for more answers for some of the issues that are going on. So we'll pray for whatever tests and things come up after that. Also noted that Zayd Gentle had some blood work that was done. They're going to have some more follow-up on that with a few other tests that are going to be coming based off of the previous blood work. So as they are looking for answers as well, I ask that you'll pray for their family and the doctors taking care of them. As for events and things that are going on, we got a list of stuff that's coming out in the bulletin tomorrow. But just want to remind you about Sunday, our time that we'll have together. Sunday afternoon, we're going to have young leaders training. We're going to start at 4. I know I sent out on Monday that it'd be at 3, but we're going to start at 4 and focus on learning how to talk about God's Word. So be ready for that. And then Sunday evening, we'll have our Sunday evening activity, but I know there's a little bit of rain that's coming in, but Mark and I are going to light up a bonfire out back. We built one for family weekend, but for homecoming, and we haven't been able to use it. So I'm going to say that if you want to stick around after services on Sunday evening, we'll have s'mores. And if you want to buy a pack of hot dogs and have dinner out there as well, you're welcome to do that. But it'll be a fun time just for us to hang out and just enjoy time together. So make your plans for all these things that are coming along. I believe that's all the announcements that I've got. If we've missed something, let us know. At this point, we'll have our devotional together.
If you're following along in your songbook, go ahead and mark number 650, Send the Light, 650. We'll sing that after our devotional thoughts this evening. Before that, we'll sing number 870, Beyond This Land of Parting. Beyond this land of parting.
Good evening. Tonight we're going to be mainly in 1 Kings chapter 19, and that's where we're going to be sticking with tonight. We're going to talk about disappointment tonight. All of us have faced some disappointments in our life, whether it's a position or a promotion or a bad grade that we didn't get, a failed relationship, and some things that just never worked out. Some of those are smaller and easier to deal with, but some are a lot more significant, and we need help, especially from God, to deal with it. So a great example of that is in with the life of Elijah in 1 Kings. And at the time, Israel was split into two nations, and Israel had wandered away from God and started worshiping Baal under the reign of Ahab. And basically, Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal and challenged them to a showdown where he challenged them to see which one would show up. Would it be Baal or God? And basically, God shows up and Baal does not. So at that point, Elijah thought he had won, and that the Lord had shown himself to the people, and Israel would repent, and they would all come back to him. But instead, the queen becomes furious with Elijah, and she sends him a death threat, which discourages him, and he has to run into the wilderness. And basically, he gets very worried and anxious, and the disappointment he has from that causes him to go into a depression. And what does the Lord do for Elijah in that moment? Well, the first thing he tells him to do in 1 Kings 9, starting in verse 4 or verse 5, "And he lay down and slept under a broom tree, and behold, an angel touched him and said to him, 'Arise and eat.' And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones in a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again." So the first thing to note is that Elijah, the Lord doesn't berate him or tell him that he needs to deal with emotional or mental health. First thing he says to do is to eat. Take care of your body, because that will help nourish your spirit. The second thing we need to take from this passage is later on down in verse 11, and it says, "And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains, broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the sound of fire, a low whisper. And Elijah heard it. He wrapped his face in a cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?'" So, what Elijah thought he needed in that moment was some great, powerful show by God, either an earthquake or fire or some kind of strong, destructive force to really show who God was, to convince Israel to come back to him. But he comes to Elijah in that moment with just a whisper, a voice. And he tells him that you just need to trust in me, and we will be able to, or this will all work out for good. Sometimes we just need to let God speak to us through study, through prayer, through just meditation, examination of His Word. And if you are struggling with that right now, we can pray for you. We can, encourage you to listen to God more, to get over some discouraging things in your life. Let's stand as we sing.
All comes ringing o'er the restless waves in the light.
Father, we come to you today, and we thank you for who you are and for all that you've done for us. Thank you for this day that you've given us and for this time we have to come together to learn more about your word. Please continue to watch over us and keep us safe and help us throughout this week. We ask that you be with all of those on our prayer list and please comfort and heal those who are sick and hurting. Thank you so much for all that you've blessed us with, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.